I still remember the exact moment I realized I had crossed a line I could never fully erase. Though at the time it felt small, almost justified, like a whisper of frustration finally finding its voice. My daughter, Emily, had always trusted me with everything, her fears, her dreams, her doubts about her marriage to Daniel, and I wore that trust like a badge of honor, believing I was protecting her by listening, by advising, by stepping in when things felt too heavy for her to carry alone. But the truth is, I didn't just listen. I absorbed, interpreted, and eventually interfered. It started with casual conversations with friends, subtle mentions of problems she was having, my tone wrapped in concern but laced with judgment. I convinced myself I was seeking guidance, but in reality I was shaping a narrative, one where Daniel became the villain and Emily the victim, because it made me feel needed, important, indispensable. The more I spoke, the more those around me validated my concerns, and slowly my words grew sharper, my opinions stronger, until I began advising Emily not just as a mother, but as someone who believed she knew better than her own child. I didn't see how every suggestion I made planted seeds of doubt in her mind, how every criticism I voiced about Daniel chipped away at her ability to see her marriage clearly. I thought I was saving her from heartbreak, but I was quietly guiding her toward it. Looking back now, I realize that love, when mixed with control, becomes something dangerous, something that can disguise itself as care while doing irreversible harm. And the worst part is, I didn't notice the damage until it had already begun to spread, quietly, invisibly, like cracks forming beneath a surface that still looked perfectly intact. At first, the changes were so subtle that I almost missed them, like the quiet shift in tone when Emily spoke about Daniel, or the way she began to question things she once accepted with patience and understanding. She would call me more often, her voice carrying a mix of confusion and frustration. And instead of grounding her, I unknowingly fueled the storm inside her. Every time she shared a disagreement, I analyzed it as if it were evidence in a case I was determined to win, pointing out Daniel's flaws, amplifying his mistakes, and reminding her of her worth in a way that made compromise feel like weakness. I thought I was empowering her, but in reality, I was teaching her to see her marriage through a lens of suspicion. The warmth that once filled her stories about Daniel began to fade, replaced by hesitation and doubt. And I didn't stop. I leaned in further. I started recalling past incidents she had already forgiven, bringing them back to life as if they were unresolved wounds, convincing her that patterns like these never truly changed. What I failed to understand was that relationships are built not just on being right, but on choosing to understand, to forgive, to grow together. Instead, I was quietly rewriting her narrative, turning temporary conflicts into permanent doubts. Soon, she began confronting Daniel with a sharpness that wasn't hers before, her words echoing my own opinions, and their arguments grew more frequent, more intense. Daniel, confused and hurt, tried to defend himself, but every defense sounded like an excuse to Emily, because I had already framed him that way in her mind. The home that once felt safe for her slowly became a place of tension, and while I watched it unfold from a distance, I still believed I was the one keeping her strong, never realizing I had become the very force pulling her marriage apart. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, devastating shift that I only recognized too late, when silence replaced the constant arguments Emily used to share with me. One evening she called, her voice unusually calm, almost detached, and told me she and Daniel had decided to take some time apart. Words that sounded controlled, but carried the weight of something far more permanent. I remember feeling a strange mix of validation and unease, as if part of me believed this outcome proved I had been right all along. Yet another part of me sensed something deeply wrong beneath that surface. As the days passed, Emily grew distant, no longer calling as frequently, no longer seeking my advice, and when she did speak, there was a heaviness in her tone that I couldn't quite reach. I tried to reassure her, reminding her that she deserved better, that she was strong enough to move on. But my words no longer landed the way they used to. Meanwhile, I began hearing things from others, mutual friends who mentioned how devastated Daniel was, how confused he seemed, how he kept asking what had changed so suddenly. It was then that a quiet discomfort started growing inside me, a realization that maybe, just maybe, the version of events I had built in my mind wasn't the full truth. I started replaying every conversation I had with Emily, every suggestion, every opinion I pushed so confidently, and I began to notice a pattern I had ignored before. I had never truly encouraged her to understand Daniel, only to evaluate him. I had never asked her what she might have contributed to their struggles, only what he had done wrong. The more I reflected, the more I saw how my influence had slowly replaced her own voice, how her decisions began to mirror my fears rather than her own feelings. And in that growing awareness, a painful question surfaced, one I couldn't escape. Had I protected my daughter, or had I quietly led her to lose something she once deeply valued? The answer came to me in a way I never expected. Not through my own reflection, but through Emily's eyes, the day she finally decided to visit me after weeks of distance that felt heavier than any argument we had ever shared. She sat across from me, quiet at first, her fingers intertwined, as if holding on to something fragile. And when she finally spoke, her words carried a calmness that felt more painful than anger. She told me she had met Daniel the day before, not to argue, not to blame, but simply to talk. And for the first time in a long while, she had listened to him without the noise of outside opinions, without the echo of my voice shaping her thoughts. She said he wasn't perfect, that he had made mistakes, but so had she. And in that conversation, she realized how much of their conflict had been magnified, stretched beyond its original size, until it became something unrecognizable. Then she looked at me, not with resentment, but with a quiet sadness that pierced deeper than any accusation could, and said that somewhere along the way she had stopped trusting her own judgment because she trusted mine more. In that moment, everything inside me fell apart. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I only wanted to protect her. But the truth stood there between us, undeniable and heavy. I hadn't just supported her. I had influenced her to the point where her choices no longer felt entirely her own. She told me she wasn't sure if her marriage could be repaired, that too much had already been said, too many wounds opened. But what hurt her most was realizing that the space between her and Daniel wasn't created by just their problems, but by the voices that surrounded them, including mine. And as she spoke, I felt the full weight of my actions settle in, not as a single mistake, but as a series of small decisions that slowly built into something irreversible. After that conversation, the silence in my home felt different, no longer peaceful, but filled with echoes of everything I wished I could take back. Every word that once felt helpful, now replaying as something intrusive and careless. I began to see my role with a clarity that was both painful and humbling, realizing that love is not measured by how much control you have over someone's decisions, but by how well you allow them to navigate their own life, even when it's difficult to watch. Days turned into weeks, and Emily continued trying to rebuild some form of understanding with Daniel. But it was fragile, like trying to mend something that had been stretched too far for too long. I kept my distance this time, resisting every urge to ask questions, to offer opinions, to guide her toward what I believed was right, because I finally understood that my involvement, no matter how well-intentioned, had already cost her enough. But staying silent didn't erase the guilt. It only made me more aware of it. I started noticing the small things I had overlooked before, like how quickly I judged Daniel without ever truly knowing him, how easily I turned temporary struggles into permanent labels, and how I mistook my own fears for intuition. One evening, Emily called again, her voice softer than before, and told me that she and Daniel had decided to try counseling, not because everything was okay, but because they both realized they hadn't given their marriage a fair chance without outside influence. I felt a flicker of hope, but it was mixed with a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that even if they managed to rebuild what was broken, the cracks I helped create would always be part of their story. In that moment, I understood that regret doesn't come from making a single wrong choice, but from realizing how many chances you had to choose differently and didn't, and that some lessons, no matter how important, come at a cost that can never be fully undone. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges of regret, but it never fully erases the shape of what once was. And as months passed, I began to understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to live with the truth of your actions, while choosing to be better moving forward. Emily and Daniel continued their counseling, slowly rebuilding a connection that had once come so naturally to them. And although their progress wasn't perfect, it was real, built this time on honesty rather than influence. I watched from a distance, no longer inserting myself into their decisions, and in that distance I found a different kind of love, one that didn't need to control or correct, but simply to support when asked. There were moments when Emily would still call me, but now our conversations felt different, lighter yet more genuine, as if she had reclaimed her own voice and I had finally learned how to listen without shaping it. One evening, she told me that things weren't magically fixed, that trust takes time to rebuild. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that what they were creating together truly belonged to them. Her words brought both comfort and a quiet ache, a reminder of how close I had come to taking that away from her completely. I apologized to her, not in a rushed or defensive way, but with the full weight of understanding behind it. And she accepted it, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. And in that moment, I realized that being a parent doesn't mean always having the right answers. It means knowing when to step back, when to trust, and when to admit that love without boundaries can sometimes do more harm than good. The lesson stayed with me, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. A reminder that the people we care about most don't need us to live their lives for them. They need us to believe that they are capable of living it themselves, even if that means allowing them to make mistakes, to grow, and to find their own way, just as Emily finally did. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the power of love, choices, and boundaries, then you are exactly where you need to be. I share stories like this to remind you that every emotion we feel has meaning, and every lesson we learn shapes who we become. So, if you want more deeply emotional, thought-provoking stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Granny's Sound channel and stay connected. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story, because every night at 8 p.m. a new journey awaits you, ready to speak to your heart before anyone else hears it.